This is DBrief, brought to you by the Australian Industry Group.
Welcome to DBrief, the podcast that explains industry to policymakers and government policy to industry, and is driven by the Australian Industry Group's mission, which is to empower industry success for a better Australia. My name is Louise McGrath, Head of Industry Development and Policy at the Australian Industry Group. And this week, we're back to usual programming, and I'm joined by Head of Research and Economics by Dr. Jeffrey Wilson. Welcome, Jeff.
Hi, Louise. How you going?
Jeff, we talk a lot about the need for a single economic market in Australia. I dare say more than any other podcast out there. This week, there's another reminder that we don't have uniformity because for one of us, daylight saving started on the weekend. Jeff, you're over in Perth and our producer Carlos is in Queensland, and you've both moved an hour away from me. And I think the disruption, Jeff, I don't know if you've got any magical data, but the disruption to business and communications must be enormous, if not just for you personally.
This is a personal bugbear of mine because for listeners, I work Melbourne office hours, which means my office hours are 6 a.m. to 2 p.m. at the moment when we're in the 3-hour time zone gap. But it is a challenging thing that we do have a very large number of time zones in Australia, given the size of our continent, but also that they move around a lot. This is a big pressure for those of us who have to operate national businesses because that 3-hour gap can be quite a lot, and it changes every time of the year, every 6 months. It's a vexing thing for me, but it's also a vexing thing. And there's a lot of other examples of this one too, Louise, like public holidays not being aligned as well. School holidays for those who have school-age kids, as I do, not being aligned as well. We're very, very far from a standard set of arrangements in Australia on some of these issues.
I do feel that the last 2 weeks were sort of a low productivity week because you had a public holiday on a Monday. Then that Friday we had our public holiday in Victoria being football day. And then this past Monday, Queensland, New South Wales, South Australia all had a public holiday. I found I actually worked more on the Melbourne football day than I did, I shouldn't say work more, but than I did on this Monday when the rest of the country was on holiday. It just feels like we'd all just stopped for 2 weeks and nothing really got pushed forward.
We're about to get a new public holiday in Western Australia added to the calendar. And one of the arguments was we had one fewer than Victoria, so we need one more. So we've got the same number as Victoria, but they're not the same days as the Victorian ones. So, Lord, make me pure, but not just yet.
Well, I can't tell you the rage I am filled with when people interstate suggest doing anything on Melbourne Cup Day, because that's a 4-day weekend now in Victoria. And, I mean, can any state ever catch up to Melbourne? Because we have the official public holidays and then the unofficial being that Monday. Anyway, all these things measured by or maintained by the National Measurement Institute, who are a very little known regulator. A shout out to them, keeping us all on the straight and narrow on time. It is a strange regulator. I thought, why on earth do we need one? Surely, the science has already been settled on how much things weigh, but it does regulate how we tell consumers that the product they're buying is a certain weight. And I remember a year or so ago getting a call from a member in a bit of a state through a cacophony of errors had discovered they'd had the wrong weight on a product they'd been selling for about 12 months. So I had to ring on their behalf to NMI and see if we can get an amnesty. And they said, no, that's all right. We're not here to hit the stick. We want to work with industry. So anyway, it was a happy outcome. But it just shows there's a lot of things that take to get a product out to market. Weights and measures is one.
And it's convenient. I think when you get like an imported food from the US where they're running 2 systems and you get like a bag of something and the weight of it's like 567 grams, and then you've got to do the nutrition panel, like how much fat per, and like it's quite nice. Like you forget about it, but it's nice that you can buy 200 grams of something, not 196 or something, right? Like it is really important. It makes life easy for consumers. It makes life easy for businesses because everyone knows, people can converge on common standards that consumers in the marketplace understand. That makes your business easier.
And I do think on NMI, at least they do have national consistency. And on that regard, fortunately, if we buy something in WA, Queensland or Victoria, we know it's the same weight.
We don't have the West Australian gram yet.
I wait. Anyway, on other news, last week, the two trade ministers from Australia and New Zealand met. And I think that's another win we can take, Jeff, because they did call out the TTMRA, which is a lot of work that James Thompson, our standards and regulatory lead, has been doing. I do think that when you're getting success, not just when you get the outcome, but all the steps to the outcome, is when a minister is well briefed on your issue, because it means that the department has been listening and are paying attention and know that this is an issue that's really affecting our members and it's top of mind.
Now, Louise, I think we're probably the only podcast in the world that talks about the TTMRA. So for those uneducated.
So this underpins the CER, which is our free trade agreement, which is 40-odd years old. So it's our oldest free trade agreement and should be it is our most substantial. It has the highest ambition in terms of creating a single economic market, which the TTMRA underpins. The basic principle is through joint standards, joint regulations. We have FSANS, so joint food standards, and then JSANS, which is joint standards. If a product is available for sale in Australia or New Zealand, it should automatically be available for sale in the opposite market. That's the number one rule. What we've found through lots of micro decisions by people who would stand up, to give evidence and say, no, we believe in a single economic market as well, but lots of micro decisions made by people over time has created this diversion from this ambition. And we are actually becoming further apart as markets, not closer.
This does actually impact on other areas. There's been a recent one. Louise doesn't know about this one yet. Australia and New Zealand have similar sets for our statistics. So, when you get the GDP data from the ABS, New Zealand does theirs the same way. And there's a lot of reasons this is useful, particularly around labour market and occupation, because one of the things that the CR has is open borders between the two countries so people can go and work in the other one. We just recently updated our occupational classification. So this is what is a builder, what is a nurse, all of those things. Unfortunately, the two statistical agencies couldn't agree. So for the first time, if you've ever heard of it, whenever you see ANZ on something, that means it's usually an Australian New Zealand standard. Just this year, we've now forked our labour market statistics. So we no longer have Australia, New Zealand classifications for these, which is going to cause, with skilled migration particularly, is going to cause all kinds of things for mutual recognition, because an occupation isn't defined in. So if you're a builder in New Zealand, you want to come into Australia, the New Zealand definition of builder is now starting to drift away as well. So it's not a trivial issue. And I mean, some of the products people might think of ladders or something like that, but there's death by 1,000 cuts, right? And it's even happening. We no longer have a joint occupations classification, which just the labour market economist worries me a bit.
Yeah. Well, I just think every little decision just creates further and further division. As a reminder, they are in our constitution. They were always meant to be the extra state, but
Western Australia is not in the preamble either. So.
I know. And I just think the market is so small that we've big push that we took, and we're going to be doing a lot of campaigning this year, is a single economic market for electrical products. Between Australia and New Zealand, we're around 2% of global GDP, yet we have 3 regulatory systems for our electrical products, of which, of course, we are the only ones with this particular electrical regime. So it's extraordinary that we would cut it by 3. But anyway, that's the state we're in, and this will be a big campaign for the next 12 months from us.
And it's not a small market. New Zealand, in the context, is about the same size as New South Wales, almost, like market size, gross product, labour force, all of those things. So if you could imagine, like, you wouldn't, if we tried to take New South Wales out of the country, everybody would notice and get pretty concerned about it. So again, it's quite significant for both sides, right?
Yeah. Anyway, we rail against Australia, rail against New Zealand. Last week, I was in Malaysia attending the East Asia Business Council meetings, which are in the margin of the ASEAN Economic Ministers meetings. And, why stop ourselves at trying to get Victoria and WA to align? Let's just try to get the whole region to align. The reason why I get invited to these is because of my involvement with them on the negotiations for the for RCEP, Regional Economic Cooperation Partnership. This is a free trade agreement between all the ASEAN countries. So I think of Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, Philippines, Indonesia, and Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, Japan, and China. It's quite significant because it was seen as by many in a narrative, the counterpoint for TPP or CPTPP as it's now called. Actually, it was driven by ASEAN. It's all the FTA partners of ASEAN, so the ASEAN plus one, except for India, which I think we've said in another podcast, I hold fully to blame it all the delays and the poor quality of the final product. So it's significant for that, but it's also significant because it's the only free trade agreement between Japan and China and South Korea, respectively, and as a group. Really, really important for those three markets, and they've really boomed. Well, their exporters have really boomed on the back of it. But it's not as comprehensive as we would like, but it's a useful conversation because we can read in the paper what's happening in the region. We can hear about the official responses to Trump's tariffs, to carbon border adjustment mechanisms, to a whole lot of big trends that are flowing through global trade. But it's much more insightful, I find, of course, to be in the room and to hear people unvarnished and hearing from ministers, hearing from industry, the way they're coping with Trump. It's just one foot in front of the other. One minister described Trump, there was Trump 1.0, which was his first administration and the trade tariffs that came into effect, described Biden's IPEF efforts as Trump 1.5, and now we're at Trump 2.0. So the trajectory of America's trade policies from Asia's point of view have not changed. And I have to say, IPEF, just drives me mad, IPEF. We had a department within DFAT, which I think is still functional, working on our own relationships to promote a foreign government's policy agenda, being IPEF, into the region. IPEF was the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. It was Biden's effort to get into the region. It wasn't trade. It didn't provide any market access, provided no trade advancement. The idea was that countries would amend their investment laws, their digital trade laws to be more worker-centric, and their worker employment laws with the vague promise of increased American investment. I don't think it was particularly successful.
But it's an interesting thing about RCEP, Louise, and this is significant for Louise and I. It was where we first professionally met over 10 years ago, being frustrated that no one knew what RCEP is, and I'm not sure they still do. It is the world's largest trade bloc, and particularly with the WTO, which has already had long-standing problems before Trump. You couldn't blame that on Trump, but that's serious issues now because of all these US tariffs, and Australia's part of it, and no one knows.
Well, from an Australian point of view, it doesn't actually give any new market access, but it does give new protections for investors, and particularly it gives greater access for accumulation of origin. So you can use the free trade agreement right across the region. So if you have product that you're exporting to Malaysia that you might add some Chinese content to and then exporting it to Thailand, that's how you would use RCEP. Bilaterally, market to market, you wouldn't use it, but you can use it in this regional. And think about, I won't quote thesis ship again because I did that, I think, a few podcasts ago, but think of, a pair of children's pajamas. It is likely to have inputs from across the RCEP region. So, if India was still there, it might have had cotton from India. But let's say it was being cut and sewn in China, perhaps designed in Australia using a Japanese anime character. There's bits of content from across the region. And so it becomes an RCEP product, not just an Australian or a Chinese product.
which is one set of documents across that whole thing, which if you haven't ever tried to export something, you won't appreciate how maddening trade docs can be across when the product's got to go across a border. So, I mean, dare I say it, Louise, this is abundance for trade docs in some respects using RCEP, right? Like this is the ability to get a single set of trade documentations, and this is made in RCEP cotton, gets processed in RCEP Vietnam, sewn somewhere else, sold into final market. It gets you towards, for some of those things, what we've got with New Zealand under that. And the compliance burden costs on businesses up and down the supply chain is huge to be able to do that at a single point, particularly at a time when the rest of the world's trade system, because of the US tariffs, and there's all these additional documents that if the product ends up in the US in some way, you have to do all this extra stuff. This is providing a real incentive when compliance burden's rising and you've got this very low compliance burden jurisdiction. It can be the difference between where you're going to orient your business or how you're going to grow it over time.
One of the advantages of the East Asia Business Council is the chair swaps around between the big three and then an ASEAN co-chairs. And Japan is very engaged, as is China, of course. Japan has the advantage of bringing JETRO to the table, and they always conduct a really insightful study in the region. We might just pause here and then we'll come back and have a chat about what JETRO found for us.
The largest Australian workplace changes in over a decade
Underpaying workers could result in crippling fines.
There'll be new rules about when a casual employee has the right
employees will have the right
to disconnect.
Workplace laws are changing. Pay attention or pay the price. Safeguard your business with Australian Industry Group. The legal experts at Australian Industry Group will help you navigate the new legislation and prepare your business for the changes. Become a member today at aigroup.com.au.
Welcome back to DBrief, and Jeff and I are talking about my recent trip to East Asia Business Council and ASEAN and the feedback we received from JETRO and their survey across the region. Jeff, one of the big things that came out, and you talked about, abundance and trade docs, the big push for digitalisation of the export documentation that was identified by their exporters that they would love to use more of the RCEP agreement for trade across the region, but it's the cumbersome nature of hard copy documents that are really holding them back.
Well, and this is, we've called this paperless trade for years as being the word for this. But it can be more than just paperless trade, because sometimes paperless trade just means I've got a hard copy document, I scan it as a PDF, and then I email it to you, which is technically paperless, but not really. That's not what we're talking about. Like we're a bit more ambitious than just scanning PDFs, right?
Yeah. We want machine-to-machine communication, and it's not just about efficiency. It's also, and it was interesting, this is the first time it's been raised in this context for me when I've attended these meetings. It's also a way to get around corruption, because when there is a document and you haven't crossed every T or dotted every I, that is an opportunity to ask for a facilitation payment or whatever. And when it is digital and machine data is being communicated across borders, machine to machine, there's no dispute, no discrepancy, there's no opportunity for corruption. And I think that's a really big play. And that sometimes is a reason for the delay, I think, in the region.
Just even some of these things in terms of the tech. I know you guys have the special edition. Well, I wasn't here on the podcast about barcodes, but there's the QR code thing in ASEAN, which is, I think Australians wouldn't get this because we usually do it just like a bus stop ad's got the QR code, right? Like it's while you wait for the bus. But this is like ASEAN's going hardcore putting a QR code on everything in trade, right? Like I don't think the Australians appreciate how far this has marched along in the region.
Well, they have barcodes on the documents, so then you can verify it by going back to a database. They also have barcode payments in Australia we have FPOS and we have bank-to-bank transfer. So if you get to send money to a friend or a family member, you can put in their bank details and transfer the money. They don't have that in ASEAN. They just have a QR code which automatically does it. And it's extraordinary because it steps away from the Visa system or the SWIFT system. It is literally just bank to bank. So they love it and want to get it across the region. But Indonesia in particular is really, really, really strong on it, as is Singapore and Malaysia.
I'm guessing it's done properly. I've recently got a QR code from a blood test centre. I had to get blood tests done, and they send you the QR. I'm like, oh, we've got a QR code in the medical system Australia. And I scanned it, and all it did was take me to a link to a PDF that I've been hunted down. No. Again, this is the scan feed. Everything the point of the QR code is that you don't have to go back to a standard document format, right? Like it's a whole separate channel. So I would really, but we're in RCEP. We're in RCEP. I think Australia's often talked about a relationship with Asia in terms of what we have to offer the region. But I think this is an example where the region has something to offer us, I reckon.
Yeah, absolutely. And their focus, ASEAN's focus on small business is pretty extraordinary. Like you rarely have a conversation where someone isn't saying, oh, but what about small business? They have very, very big, successful conglomerates run by, very, very wealthy families, but every conversation gets down to, is this usable by a small business? Which I don't think happens in the same context in Australia.
No.
Linked to that and linked to the corruption story, what I found really interesting about the meeting was how often the Gen Z, or the Gen Z, my daughter keeps saying it should be called Gen Z revolution and uprisings. So there's Indonesia, there was Nepal, there was Philippines. There was a lot of discussion around the causes. Obviously, there's corruption, but there's also, the words jobless growth was mentioned several times by different people. And I just think this is an emerging area of the sort of social discourse that hasn't really happened in Australia yet. We talk about the housing crisis and generational gap, but it's not quite the same. And of course, people aren't burning Parliament houses down. It is not quite the same as it is in the region, but you could tell it was on the tip of the tongue, lots and lots of content around that.
And the task is that because of that demographic boom that, a lot of Asian countries had because of big development uplifts about a generation ago now, which led to huge education outcomes, reduced maternal deaths, high fertility rates, that you've now got this whole group coming through. It is a big development challenge. And we often, when you talk about international business, you often say youthful population, high growth. This is a good thing, right? But these are economies that have to generate several million new jobs a day just to soak up everyone that's coming through that development dividend over 2 generations of it. And the Australian economy has to generate about 1,000 new jobs per day to keep unemployment under control. These are countries that have to, the scale of the task to do that, like youthful demographics is a benefit, but you do have to, it's not a costless benefit for these countries. It's a big challenge, as that group goes through.
Well, India adds about 1 million 18-year-olds to the market every month, and that's huge. And Australia used to always say that was a plus. I say, but, what's their spending power? A million 18-year-olds, yes, as you say, can be an opportunity, but it's also a responsibility and potentially a burden if not managed carefully and properly.
Well, and in the context particularly, we don't want to over-Trump this because we had been doing some Trump update. Fortunately, Trump actually did do pharmaceutical tariffs. You should probably mention that in a second since we last did this podcast. But it's at a time, like we've talked about how Australia is a trade-exposed country a lot and how not just direct impact of Trump's tariffs, but all the chaos that causes in supply chains. But consider that, our GDP trade exposure is about 50%. Like most countries in Asia, that's over 100. I think it's 400 or something insane for Singapore, right? And so suddenly they've got this they have to achieve growth rates of 4 or 5 or 6% a year to be able to absorb that demographic group successfully and give people jobs and meaningful connection to the economy. And then Trump goes and announces tariffs, which hit some of these countries up to the 40%, Vietnam, 30, 40% for some of these countries. Our concern in Australia, it really puts it in relief. This is far more existential for these countries' industries and societies than it is for us.
Yeah, and Vietnam especially, because after the first Trump administration and the pressure on Chinese products and exports, which then affected Australia, that was of many Australian firms' option was their China plus one strategy. That plus one was Vietnam. And the fact that it's also now hit with the tariffs. Because we have to remember, I think people forget, we manufacture a lot. Australia manufactures a lot of stuff in China, which they then sell to the world. That is not Australian product. They are really Chinese exporters with an Australian address because the product itself has the origin, not where your headquarters are.
But it's probably Australian IP though, and so that's the thing. Like, it's very hard just because the export didn't come from your country. Australia makes a lot of return from our foreign investment, a lot of IP, what we call IP rent. So the bit of the value that goes back to the person who owns the IP, made in China could be generating a lot of value and investment and R&D in the Australian market. I wish we could get statistics on this. It's actually really hard to measure, so none of the official systems capture it properly. But there's this unknown element to that, is how much of what we're doing in our economy is actually connected to Australian IP manufacturing in Southeast Asia to the US market. We've got no idea how much that's going to impact us yet.
No, because we only ever measure actual goods. But as you say, it's the IP and the value that really matters at the end of the day.
Well, Trump hasn't he hasn't discovered IP or services yet. He's only putting tariffs on goods.
Almost. Films, he wants to put 100% tax on what did he call it? American films made overseas. Or foreign, I'm not sure, all foreign films.
Dear idea. We might just mention, as I mentioned at the pharmaceutical tariffs, this one's just because it's confusing and it might point to something new. So over early last week, Trump announced there would be a 100% tariff on pharmaceutical products, but there was a couple of catches. They were branded, so we presume that means not generic drugs. And also, except if the company that makes them is building a new manufacturing facility in the US, which is just from anyone who's been involved in trade. This is really confusing because normally a tariff goes on a product. If it's a steel spring and it's a steel spring, it pays the tariff, except if the company that made the steel spring might have done some deal. How do you verify that they're building a factory in the US, and how do you get trade docs for that? I think there are a few Australian companies that will be affected by this that are in a bit of a tricky situation. But more broadly, one of the things is this company-specific tariffs is now what we've got. And I don't think I've never seen a company-specific tariff in my career.
No, we're certainly breaking new ground. I think the problem with that is that Trump announced it on his Truth Social, but we haven't actually seen any official documentation yet on. So, and it's the pharmaceutical investigation is one of a bunch. I think there's now about 12 what they call 232 investigations. So the steel and aluminium tariffs were under a 232, and that is a sort of a strange bit of, a small bit of American trade law, which means that if it's identified that it undermines the security setting of America, then tariffs can be applied. Steel, you could sort of say, because you can see the direct link between steel and defence products. Pharmaceuticals, unclear. Furniture, very unclear. Like there's a whole lounge suites and things. I think.
Well, my favourite on furniture is only upholstered furniture. So if it doesn't have upholstery on it, you're okay. So if you just want a nice timber chair, you're okay. If you want a cushion on it and it's sewn in, national security threat.
I can't imagine Trump ever sitting on a non-cushion chair. So perhaps that's what's driving that.
Is the national security into the concept of the president's comfort? Yeah.
Anyway, not getting off track. So I think that's all we've got time for today, Jeff. So thanks. If you found this podcast via the AR Group website, please subscribe on your usual podcast platform so you don't miss an episode. And if the platform lets you leave a review, please do take the time to leave one. My name's Louise McGrath and I've been joined by Jeff Wilson. And if you have any comments or questions, please email industry.policy@argroup.com.au and we'll speak in a couple of weeks. Thanks.